How's your week going?
It's been going pretty well.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as we record, I think it's Thursday, and I really can't complain this week, thankfully.
My kids are off on winter break. I don't know about yours. We have winter break and spring break because apparently up in the north, I don't know if this is true or not. I'm an implant from not here, but I think the ski resorts made some sort of deal with the school districts so that they could get all the kids to go doing ski retreats and all that sort of stuff. I don't know if that's true. I'm making that up, but I think I heard it somewhere.
I never heard that, but I believe every word of that is true.
Yeah. So if we had any snow up here, then that would be really relevant for everybody. But it has been such a dry, non-snowy week or season that I don't know.
We have gotten more snow in the last 10 days than we've had in 2 years in Pennsylvania. So especially where I am, we've gotten hit. So finally things are thawing. And sometimes when that happens, my basement where I'm recording floods, but so far so good.
Well, I was thinking about you this week because I heard a song by John Mayer. Halfway through, he's talking about like one day our generation's going to rule the population. And I was like, yeah. And then I was like, wait, then we probably won't, because Gen X just gets passed over all the time. And it made me think about this meme I saw a couple months ago. It was from CBS, and it was talking about the different generations. It's got the silent generation, and it's got the boomers, it's got millennials, and it's got Gen Y on it. And like Gen X is nowhere to be found on this meme. And I was like, that is the most Gen X thing to ever happen to us. We don't even exist on CBS's little generational chart of who we are. So I was like, I don't know, maybe we won't actually rule the population because they'll just forget to elect us.
Yes, because as we've talked about, the boomers can't stop, won't stop. They're like an early 80s hip hop crew, and they won't stop. And Gen Z is not going to wait, you know. And the millennials are already right behind us, and they're already taking jobs that we should have had, or, you know, as we wait for boomers to never retire. And we talked about this in terms of our politics, why, you know, everybody from Jon Stewart to Ezra Klein to Nikki Haley all say both of these guys are too old. And I think all three of those people are right about that.
But Jon Stewart looks too old too.
I know. I think he needs to lose the beard, honestly.
Oh, is that maybe me too? I'm getting the gray.
Yeah, no, you're good. You're good. But it's just for him, it's just too stubbly and gray, so it almost looks like he forgot.
Hello and welcome back to Worst Church Ever. I am Chris.
And I'm Nathan.
And we're two lifelong friends navigating the intersections of the secular and sacred in this space every Monday, and all the days between in the course of our daily lives as husbands, fathers, and followers of Jesus, rejecting fundamentalism and exploring cycles of trauma and healing in the redemptive stories of Scripture and in the reflections of the sacred all around us.
So grab some baked goods and a cup of coffee, because it's time for a discussion at Worst Church Ever. Add your thoughts and comments online, and don't forget to subscribe so we can keep the conversation going.
When I was in college, I was an intern for ABC News for the 2000 RNC, National Republican Convention in Philly. And I worked with like Peter Jennings and those guys. And I was basically a gopher. But what I got to do was I got to sit in on a lot of stuff. And I got to walk around. At that time, it was either called the First Union Center or the Wachovia Center, but it's where the Flyers still play. And they had all the green rooms set up all throughout the complex. And I got to watch Jon Stewart and Tom Brokaw doing some things that they were recording to be broadcast later, just little 30-second things, promos basically. And Jon Stewart, and this is 24 years ago, so there's a younger Jon Stewart, and The Daily Show hadn't yet become the cultural force that it became under him. But in between takes, that guy could not turn it off. And I was like, oh my gosh, this guy's trying so hard. And it worked, you know, but he could not shut it off. So he's cracking jokes to Tom Brokaw in between every single take. And Tom Brokaw's kind of just like, you know, and Stewart's like making fun of the cue cards. And he's like, are these people writing this in crayon? And like all this other stuff. And then he became who he became. And actually, it was nascent at that time, because I remember I saw Mo Rocca, or Rocca, I'm not sure how he says
Rocca.
it. Yeah, and he was trying to pull aside like unsuspecting old Republican delegates to interview them. And I happen to know one of the guys he was trying to talk to, because it was a guy who ran for Congress locally where I live. And I was like, Bob, don't engage. Nothing against Mo Rocca, but this is going to make you look terrible. And this is before being a Republican meant you were batshit crazy, by the way. This was still compassionate conservatism, relatively mainstream, the party of Bob Dole and Papa Bush, not the party of Donald Trump. But even then, I'm like, Bob, don't. Just trust me on this.
Don't engage.
So,
this is the Daily Show. It's not going to go well.
Yeah. The Daily Show sounds like that's a news show, right? Well, it is. And actually, speaking of Gen X, it became where we got all of our information for a lot of people anyway. But
yeah. In college, there was a crossover where Jon Stewart was taking over. And a lot of people didn't think he was going to make anything of it. They were really skeptical that he was going to, make it. And yet, under Jon Stewart, we had Mo Rocca, I think he's on NPR now. He's a legitimate, I think he's actually not legit because he was legit before, but official news, not joke news. And you also saw a whole bunch of other actors get their start under Jon Stewart. Steve Carell was a correspondent.
Yep.
Stephen Colbert has Jon Stewart to thank for that. And there was a lot of other people that really got their start from Jon Stewart, and he launched so many careers.
He did. And before he took it over from Craig Kilborn, the show wasn't overtly political. It was lampooning the news, but Jon Stewart, he sees that moment because like when I was seeing him in the green room, of course, Bush hadn't yet even been nominated, let alone elected. And so then in the aftermath of Bush getting elected and then 9/11 and then the reactions to 9/11 and the Iraq War, that crucible was when Stewart really took off.
Yeah.
And you could, it's a good question. If there had been no Iraq War, would there be a Daily Show still? And
yeah, maybe not.
What would the left even look like, let alone the right? So I think it was a needed response to a lot of existential anxiety about what the hell we were doing. And I don't have easy answers for that. As you know, my cousin fought in Iraq and he died after the fact as a result of that. And at the same time, I did ethics papers on that in div school about, well, if there's really WMD, then maybe we're justified, maybe we're not. It's complicated. I'm not here to relitigate the war on our podcast. But had that not gone the way it did, our entire political system would look completely different.
Yeah. I was significantly influenced by the fact that my brother was in the initial invasion of Iraq. He was part of the ground forces that went in there and the initial invasion of Afghanistan prior to that, right after 9/11. And so I'm there going I don't really want my brother to be involved in this and stick his foot in it.
Yeah.
It's always easy to play quarterback when we're on this side of that particular war because we didn't know what was going on. And we certainly had a person in power who was claiming that he had weapons of mass destruction. And again, I don't think it turned out that there were, but it's hard to ignore a local despot that has that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And probably wants to use them. In fact, I seem to remember one of the first movies that you and I ever went to see together was Hot Shots Part 2.
Hot Shots Part 2.
Where Saddam Hussein is the bad guy, and that's the whole... But, it's hard to ignore somebody like that. Were we justified in going? I don't know. But...
yeah.
At the time, we were all worried.
Sure.
Just gotten attacked.
I was taking a senior year of college it was a combined class, political science and biology, because it was about weapons of mass destruction and did Hussein have them, basically.
Yeah.
And we had a visitor come who was a UN's weapon inspector. And I remember his name to this day because it was a really cool Italian name. His name was Rocco Casagrande. And he basically said Iraq, Hussein, is not letting the UN inspection regime into any of these facilities. So on a very sort of legalistic particular read of the treaty that ended the first Gulf War, Saddam Hussein was in open violation of the terms of the armistice from the first Gulf War. What did he expect would happen? Now, that doesn't mean we were right or wrong, but you can make the ethical argument, if you're interested in doing that he started the war because he flaunted the terms of the first ceasefire or armistice or whatever it was. And then how soon did Gaddafi try to be like, never mind, I don't have anything? But that didn't go so well for him. So,
well, yeah, and that's the thing. We live in a superpower that clearly has weapons of mass destruction, so it's easy for us to sit here and pontificate to others that they're not allowed to have them.
Yeah.
But if you're a despot in a small country that really would like to be a world power, how can your neighbors stay scared of you if you're like, oh, no, I don't have any? Like, you're not a threat if you don't have
exactly.
anything that can wipe out your neighbors. So again, like for us sitting here in the United States with the biggest military infrastructure in the whole world, 10 times as much as any other nation combined, it's very easy for us to throw stones at Saddam Hussein. But the reality is, like, everybody's doing the best they can to defend their own country, and some of that's posturing, right? And
yeah, you're right. Yeah, and you look at Kim Jong-un, who postures all the time, and he probably has the stuff, but he still postures, you know. And obviously, it's not lost on us that Hussein, not only was he a despot, but he's butchering the Kurds and even other, other people within his country that didn't agree with him or weren't part of the Ba'athist party. So, none of this is to take away from any of that. But you make a really good point that in the real politique system of the world, you can't really expect these nations to be completely honest with the world order about what they do and they don't have, because we're certainly not, nor would we ever try to be. So it's dicey. Let's put it that way.
It's both sides, right? It's like, if we don't have them, then we're worried that we're going to get toppled. And if we do, then we're going to get investigated. So it's kind of both sides. And that's why Gen X will never be president of the United States. It's nothing to do with that.
It's like we were saying on text. The funny thing about that graphic from CBS isn't just that we were forgotten, but that, each of those generations had years attached to it. And no one thought that between 1965 and 1980, there's no dates here. Like, it wasn't just the generation was missing. Even the dates, they just skip right over the dates.
No one was born then. No one was born.
No. So, I don't know, man. It's crazy. And we said it was fitting because we were the first generation to be systemically neglected, right? I think I said to my wife, as our parents were either pursuing their careers or their coke habits, right? Like, if we want to be really 80s stereotypical. But
not our mothers, but in general.
Not our parents.
Well, that I know of.
But,
I mean, you never know. Maybe Mama Coca and Mama Key were more to that than I know.
My mom had a Diet Coke habit. She's addicted to Diet Coke. But the other thing I'll say about this whole thing is, we said this on text this week, like, how fitting, how fitting that we're forgotten, because that's why we're called Gen X, because we had no name. What should we call these kids? I don't know. X.
Yeah.
None of the above.
No. Oh man. And we're at the tail end of Gen X, so we sort of have some of the characteristics of millennials and some of the characteristics of X. It really depends on who I'm with.
I always think about it this way, and they talk about people born like in 79, 80, 81 as the Zennials or the X-Zennials, whatever. I remember in junior high and high school, in 9th grade, which was still junior high at that time, we had a typing class, and we were still using electric manual typing machines, typewriters. And then in the next year, after we left, they switched over to all PC lab. But then in 10th grade, PC application, that class was learning how to use DOS in 1995. And then the very next year, after I took that class in 10th grade, all the new 10th graders had everything Windows 95. So it's like that, it's literally just right before and after us, which is really kind of fascinating. So
I never got a chance to be top of the class in Springhouse Elementary School because we went to Florida when I was right between the summer of 8th and 9th grade. So you got a chance to be at the top of the 9th grade, like the top of the middle school, as it were, and I had to go back to the bottom.
Yep.
We had Macs.
And did you really?
Yeah, our school had Macintosh computers. It was really odd because I had Commodore 64 growing up, and then I had some sort of IBM clone, and this is Macintosh. I'm like, what in the heck is this? Now I have one, and I love it. But it was at the time, I was like, there's only one button. What? I want 2 buttons on my mouse. Why is there only one? How backwards is this?
Yeah, exactly. That's good. That's good. Well, all this conversation about generational anxiety, displacement, being forgotten, and about all of the many conflicts between world powers, especially in the Middle East, all of this pertains to what we're going to talk about in terms of the scripture for today. So actually, really interesting. That's how we ended up getting there, which was not really pre-planned, but it all came together.
That's right. And I think that...
Good job.
It was completely accidental on purpose. Maybe because we're thinking about these things all week. So, this week we want to talk a little bit more about the Jacob and Esau story. We left off in chapter 27. We're going to do 28 today. So this is a number of episodes ago when we left off with Rebecca instructing Jacob to steal the blessing, and he kind of gets away with it.
I've thought more and more about the duality of Rebecca. In one way, we talked about, she's abusing her elderly husband, and I'm assuming he's a good deal older than she is, just given the dynamics of how things worked back then. But we talked about elder abuse, right?
Yeah.
Their trickery of him, if he truly was fooled and wasn't actually secretly complicit. We talked about that. Then we also talked about how that trickery may have been one of the only avenues available to a woman in Rebecca's situation to exert any kind of agency in her family. So that's really interesting to think about. And we often paint with really broad strokes when it comes to the patriarchy and when it comes to how women have been disenfranchised over the millennia, because we know damn well that they have been. And anytime anybody wants to start to think, women had it pretty easy, just remember that women in this country didn't vote until like 1920. Like my grandparents were born in the 20s. Like that's insane, right? But at the same time, I was recently watching a musical called The School for Scandal, and it was written in the colonial era, and I think it was first published in 1775. It's out of Great Britain. I forget the name of the playwright. He's very famous. And I was amazed how in that drama, it was so modern, even though it's so old. And the women used basically the tools of, manners, of society, of perceived, I don't want to say ethics, but the rules of the game, basically, to really run the show. And so it's interesting to see that a man writing that play back then was able to articulate that the women, even though they didn't have overt real power in any meaningful way whatsoever, were still in a very subversive and a very shrewd and necessary way. They were still doing whatever they could to be able to have some kind of agency in their lives. So I think those two parts of thinking about the patriarchy as it pertains to our own recent history and as it pertains to ancient history are really interesting, because as different as things are between the Bronze or Iron Age and now, I guess there are some things that are the same, and it's hard to know what's the same and what's different, and it's hard to know when we're reading these what's our modern lens and what's sort of universal, but I think those things are interesting as observations. So we could cast Rebecca as sort of this immoral actor, but at the same time, what other agency does she have? I think we're right to suspect not very much.
Yeah, she's using the agency that she has at hand to influence her outcomes, right?
I would suggest that the Hebrew scriptures are replete with that motif of women doing that. And then, interestingly enough, in the New Testament, you get Jesus overtly empowering women on purpose in so many diverse ways. And then, of course, what happens? People are people, and they crystallize and calcify traditions that end up subjugating women again, which is, terrible, obviously. So,
well, 27 actually ends with a little bit of Rebecca pulling the strings again, because she notices that Esau is pretty much going to abandon his mother because of what's going on here, and definitely has it out for Jacob. He's got murder on his mind. And so she starts to pull the strings, and she goes to Isaac, and she basically starts complaining to Isaac, like, hey, like, I do not want Jacob to get married to one of these Hittite women or one of these Canaanites. So, like, we need to figure something out for him. And the next chapter picks up, not with Rebecca saying this, but here's verse 1-9. Isaac, again, not Rebecca, but Isaac summons Jacob, blessed him, and commanded him, saying, you should not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. So hang on, let me back up just like before we keep on going. So this is kind of what you're talking about, right? She knows what's up. She has this power and influence over Isaac. And so she's kind of going behind the curtains, so to speak, and getting what she wants, which is ultimately probably more than just a wife for Jacob. She's wanting him out of the picture so that Esau doesn't kill him. Does that sit right?
Yeah. I think so. And I think she's also doing what women have always found themselves having to do, which is looking out for their own. And she's, by sending Jacob to Laban, she's also further incorporating her own family of origin into the covenant and into the material blessing of the Abraham line as well.
Point.
So she's looking out for her people. Not just her son, but her extended family.
Her people, because that's where she's from. I'm reading from Robert Alter's translation and commentary. So Robert Alter he's actually translated the entire Old Testament now, and it's incredibly good and incredibly rich. So I'll just read the whole thing here, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about it. We're only going to cover 1 through 9, because I think there's a lot there.
Yep.
Isaac summoned Jacob and blessed him and commanded him and said to him, "You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Rise and go to Padam Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take you from there a wife from the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. And may El Shaddai bless you and make you fruitful and multiply, so you shall become an assembly of peoples. And he may grant you the blessing of Abraham, to you and your seed as well, that you may take hold of the land of your sojourning, which God granted to Abraham." And Isaac set Jacob off, and he went to Padam Aram, to Laban, son of Bethuel, the Aramean, brother of Rebekah, mother of Jacob. And Esau saw that Isaac had blessed Jacob, and had sent him off to take a wife from there, and blessed him and charged him by saying, "You shall not take a wife from the daughters of Canaan." And Jacob listened to his father and to his mother, and went to Padam Aram. And Esau saw that the daughters of Canaan were evil in the eyes of Isaac his father. And Esau went to Ishmael, and took Mahalath, daughter of Ishmael, and son of Abraham, in addition to his wives, as a wife. And that's the end of verse 9. And I hopefully I got those pronunciations right, because there's a lot of words in there that are interesting.
Yeah.
So we've got Jacob blessed again. This guy just gets blessing after blessing.
He gets everything. It's so fascinating to me that a couple episodes ago, we really stressed the idea. And like, obviously we know these stories because we grew up with them, you and I, but we didn't like really read ahead. But we started to talk about patterns where Esau really was a type of Ishmael figure, right? And now he literally is marrying Ishmael's daughter, which is just one of the many fascinating things happening in these 9 verses.
Yeah. So you've got Jacob, who's going back to Laban, which is Rebekah's root, and Esau, who's doubling down and going back to Ishmael, which is Abraham's root.
Yeah.
Which is just interesting to see that dynamic playing out here. I feel so much empathy for Esau, who's watching this play out. He watched his blessing get taken, and now he's watching Jacob be sent away to marry somebody else. He's seeing the xenophobia of his mom, and now he's seeing it in his dad. And he does the only thing he can do. He's like, well, maybe I didn't get the blessing because of my wives. What a terrible place to be, where you can feel like the contempt of your parents because of who you married.
I just have to sit with that for a second, because that's the story of just so many modern families, you know. Without getting into too much of my own family bullcrap, I have an uncle who, when he was very young, his wife died. They had 2 daughters. Those are my cousins. And he very soon thereafter remarried. And my grandmother and his second wife had a just not good history. And a lot went wrong, and a lot of wrong things were done on both sides. But I do know that I can't imagine what it feels like to feel like you have to choose between your spouse and your parent. I guess I'll say that, because anything else I could say would be far too personal if anybody that I love is watching this,
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And we gloss over these verses because we're like, oh, let's get to the story about Laban and the sheep and the tricking Jacob into working for him for 14 years and marrying 2 sisters, and how like weird and kinky is that, and all that other stuff. And by the way, now that I'm thinking about it, shit. My 2 cousins, those girls that I mentioned, who I love dearly, their middle names are Rachel and Leah, which are the 2 people that Jacob goes and marries.
Yeah.
In Laban's household.
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to make light of that if anybody's watching that knows me, but shit, that's insane. All right, I'm done. I'm done for the day, man.
I don't think that the weight of this story for Esau specifically has ever really hit me as hard as it did when I was reading these, and just being like, just looking at the decision that he's got, he's left with nothing. He knows his brother and his mom have basically taken everything that he thought was coming to him. And he's like, was it because I married the wrong woman? And he's trying so hard. He's trying so hard to fit in this family. He's like, well, I'll go marry one of the cousins, not one of the Canaanites, not one of the Hittites. I'll go find somebody that's closer, that's like in the family. Is that going to make it okay? Will that be something that will help me get back? Will you bless me then, Dad? Is there not a blessing for me? Well, what if I get this other wife? What if I change my life completely? Like, is there anything I can do to get back on your side? Like, this is a son who so desperately wants the approval of his father and his mother. And he has been tricked out of it time and time again. And he's just left doing whatever he can to get something back from them. And I know personally so many young men and young women who are in that exact spot where they're just so desperate for their parents' blessing, for their parents' approval, for somebody to come alongside them and say, we love you. There's a place for you. There is a blessing for you. And you don't have to go marry a third person to get it.
It's like that scene in Fight Club where Brad Pitt says to Edward Norton, maybe another woman isn't what we need. Like, now I think that has other implications in that story, but yeah, don't keep repeating the cycle of trauma, I guess. That's heavy, man. That's really heavy. And he really does get glossed over, and he gets treated like, oh, he's just this ruffian. That's a good example of how not to be. But he's a human being, and he's meant to be taken as a human being in these stories, not just as a type, not just as a literary figure or motif. And when you really start to think about whether or not these people were real historically, they're certainly real in the narrative. And they're meant to be taken as flesh and blood people. And these 9 verses are an excellent example of how in just a few sentences, you are dealt with a galaxy of human emotion and trauma and relationship stuff and everything else.
Yeah.
That's why the Bible's so rich. That's why we study it. At least, when
you look later on and it's this passage saying, Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated. And in fact, I think it even became the name of a book, right? Jacob I have loved. I think that's a very popular book. And Esau I have hated. And I think I always kind of looked at that as like almost a prescription, like we should hate Esau and we should love Jacob. And I don't know if that's necessarily what it was. I think it was probably more of just, you can see that there's favoritism for Jacob, and Esau's pretty much treated like trash by his family.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just overlooked and hated.
Yeah. He's a scapegoat also, Yeah. And if anybody wants to go back and look at the episode where we talked about the way in which Esau and Ishmael have so many similarities, we talked about how we felt like in his heart, Isaac really favored Esau because he reminded him so much of his half-brother. And yet here's Isaac also, falling prey to repeating cycles of exclusion rather than extending the true meaning of the blessing and the covenant, which is supposed to be embrace.
Yeah. And I think as parents, we end up doing that a lot of times. We repeat those cycles, right? As much as we want to end those cycles of abuse or betrayal, generational trauma, in the heat of the moment when we're picking between our wife and our son, right? So who are we going to pick? And oftentimes we're choosing our spouse. In this case, Isaac's choosing Rebecca. And as much as he may actually want to end that cycle of generational trauma, he's basically shoving Esau aside and saying, you don't get it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, earlier you'd asked that question, how many people actually have to choose between their spouse and their parents? And I'd say that also kind of flows out there, that spouse and the children. And, I think that's always a decision that we've got to make as a priority for ourselves is, where does my allegiance lie, right? And I don't think that the allegiance to spouse precludes parents or siblings or children or coworkers, but sometimes it does. Sometimes when you got 2 priorities, you got somebody that wants to do one thing and you got somebody that wants to do another thing, and you really do have to work it out with whoever it is, whether it's the spouse or children. And it is tough. I think that's one of the reasons why the biblical narrative has that phrase, leave and cleave. It's like you really can't choose between your parents and your spouse. You're going to have to leave this one thing behind and go off, because if you try to stay in this family unit when you're trying to create a new one, you're just never going to be able to do it. It's never going to work out.
That's a really good insight, and it reminds me of on Reddit there is the "Am I the asshole?" thread, and so often the answer is yes, but so often the problems in those have to do with meddling in-laws or people who get married but can't stop trying to please their parents or prove themselves to their parents or win their parents' affection.
Yeah.
How can you have anything emotionally ready for your spouse if you're still at 30 or 40 years old trying to feel like you have your parents' approval, you know?
Yeah.
And so that's one thing. And our families are, in general, are so dysfunctional. And we joke about Gen X being forgotten, but we've also talked about how, you know, Gen X honestly being that first latchkey generation and how there's new or newer dysfunctions that are downstream of that in the history of our society that we're still coming to terms with as people like you and I enter our mid-40s and we look back at how we were raised or how we weren't raised or whatever it may be.
Yeah.
You talked about adults in your life not having great boundaries when you were young, and I think in our last episode, and I can definitely commiserate with that in a lot of ways too. And there are all kinds of other examples that are downstream of this new way of being family in sort of the late 70s, early 80s. So there's that. But then there's also this idea that Jesus has, and he says it in such a pointed way that I really have to sit with it and wrestle with it. He says in a couple translations, unless comparatively you hate your family of origin, you can't really follow me. And I don't think he really means hate, but I think what he is trying to say is what you're saying, which is you can't start something new if you're not willing to leave behind childhood trauma that's unresolved, if you're not willing to be healed from that and let me heal you from that, if you're not willing to walk with me so that I can heal you, if you're not willing to set aside your overriding desire to know for certain that your parents approve of you. If you can't let that stuff go, you're not going to really be able to follow me because they might not like it, number one, or for any number of other reasons, because you're not really all in to your own healing. You're still trying to heal in very narrow terms as you think they're prescribing. I think that's what he means. And I don't think I would have gotten to that without this stuff in the story of Jacob and Esau.
I think that's really well said. And I don't think that's something I'd really thought about before in terms of that passage, because it does, people try to explain it away like, oh, well, the love that you show for Jesus should be so great that it makes it look like hate for your parents. I think I've heard that phrase at some point in time.
Oh,
but
yeah.
I think, no, it's more of that drawing that line, leaving and cleaving, like leaving the history and the baggage behind. But it's not as easy as that, right? It's not as easy as just making the choice, like, I'm going to leave it behind. Like, it does take work. It's not something that you just get out of because you make a conscious decision that I'm not going to care about what my parents think anymore, right? It's a little harder than that.
For lots of reasons, because you might be entangled in all kinds of different relationships or whatever. For reasons of biochemistry, we always talk about the body keeping the score. All kinds of reasons that it's way harder than just deciding and saying.
Yeah.
Which is why this journey with Jesus, it needs to be a holistic journey to health.
Yeah.
And it's interesting, too, that Jesus has the experience of being mocked and saying, isn't this the carpenter's son? Isn't this the kid from Nazareth? Like, he himself has to say, I'm a grown-up, you know? If I can put this word in Jesus' mouth, I'm a grown-ass man. I'm the grown-ass son of man. And he himself has to make a demarcation that who you think I am based on who my parents were and what town I came from, grow up and put that aside and understand that we, at some point, have to make our own decisions. As hard as that is, and that, guess what? You don't do it on your own. It takes a band of disciples. It takes a synagogue or a faith community, or it takes some kind of community of mutual support and love and understanding and compassion and grace.
Yeah.
And sometimes instead of all those things, we settle for these organizations that we call church or that we call, self-help groups or recovery groups. And really, Jesus keeps calling us back to living those things in real ways beyond just whatever those spaces of meeting might be in those places of hierarchy and religiosity.
I feel like I'm in this place now, as you say that, where like I don't want to be involved in a community of faith that's not helping me say goodbye to old wounds.
That's brilliant. Brilliantly said. Yeah.
And that's going to take on different looks and feels depending on who you are and, you know, what your past trauma has been and your generational issues that you've got going on. But many churches and other institutions end up looking very much like a dysfunctional family because they aren't helping people move past dysfunction. And so they're just perpetuating it. They're perpetuating cycles of abuse. They've got power struggles. They've got, you know, whether or not we're playing my favorite song this week is the issue that's going to divide this church, or what color the carpet is, and, you know, getting really upset because like no one consulted me on whether or not we were going to redo the drapes this week. You know, that sort of infighting and that sort of trauma that's perpetuated, that's a sign that you've got a community where you're not helping each other grow and get past those wounds that you probably picked up as a child. And so, you know, it's just a challenge for all of us to say that. Like even Jesus, his first miracle that he performs is the water into wine. And didn't they get his mom to try to get him to do it? Like hey.
Yeah, she nagged, if this doesn't sound sexist, she nags him into doing it. And he's like, are you freaking kidding me?
Right.
Fine.
So it's not like Jesus didn't have to deal with this. Like he did. And
Absolutely.
There's lots of little accounts
like Mary,
where they bring up his family to him, and he's like, I don't have any family. I don't have any. This is my family here. And then he goes out and talks to him.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. He doesn't reject them, but he says, let's put things in perspective. You know, there are many instances, I shouldn't say many, but there are a couple instances, the wedding at Cana that you mentioned being the first, where Mary, or by extension, the immediate family of Jesus, they're just being total boomers to his John Cusack Gen Xer who just is there to enjoy a party and be blessed by being with people, you know? But you're exactly right. Jesus, come on out. Your mom's here. Well, listen, I have other priorities too. It doesn't mean my mom's not a priority, but it does mean I don't always drop everything to run back to my family of origin, especially when they don't seem to be getting the point of what I'm trying to do here.
Yeah.
You know?
So when Jesus says those words, you've got to hate your family, I don't think he hates his family, because he clearly is like, okay, fine, Mom. And he's telling people, I don't have a family other than these people here that are hearers and doers of the word. But then he goes out to them, right? And so it's not like he's cut them out completely, but at the same time, there is a clear line in the sand where he's actually making a statement of like, this isn't my time. I'm going to do this. I don't know why he decided to do it, quite frankly, the water into wine. But it does feel like his mom is like, you know, hey, Jesus, can you save the Little League World Series for us? Right? It's like my son's a pitcher. We can bring him in.
Yes. And Nathan, how often in your own life have you found yourself saying, why am I even doing this? You know?
Right.
And sometimes that can even, and there are times when like, you don't want to go to Thanksgiving with your family. You don't want to go to the wedding at Cana, but you go anyway.
Yeah.
And hopefully Jesus provides this model that, all right, like, can we hold some things in tension and still try to be a blessing to people, even if we'd rather be anywhere else?
Yeah.
But something else you said, I think, you mentioned how when he says, who are my brothers, who is my mother, people who are hearers and doers of the word, I think in that there's also every expectation. I think Jesus has every expectation that will describe his mother and his literal brothers, that they will be, or that they already are, without even realizing it, part of this new way of understanding family. That it's not just them that's family, but they're included in this radical new understanding of family that he underscores when he's actually in the process of dying. And he says, woman, behold your son. And he makes sure that Mary and John are bonded in a way that will bless them both.
Yeah.
So even as he's dying, he's taking care of the beloved disciple and of his mom, who he loves.
That's a good point. So a few years ago, I was leading worship at a church, and frequently I'd have people make requests of songs that they wanted to sing on Sunday morning. And I'd say probably 75% of the time or more, I would smile politely and say, thanks, we'll look into it, and then never play that song because it's not karaoke. This isn't Total Request Live. This is, usually a worship service that we're planning in conjunction with like a number of other people, and right. So it's not, but my mom had actually made a request, and my first impulse was like, no, I'm not playing that, Mom. But then I was like, you know what? Maybe it would work. And I thought about it, and I had to actually come to that place. What you're saying is, like, my mom goes to this church. So just because it's my mom doesn't mean I should say no. Like, I should think about this like I would think about a request from anyone and not just throw it out randomly. And so there's been some times when songs actually did work, and it's like, yeah, well, you know what? Good news. We actually were doing a message that tied into that theme completely. So absolutely we can do it. And other times, no, we're not playing that song because it doesn't matter how much you like it. It's not going to add anything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I will say, and this gets really into now the life of the parish church. Our churches, I think every institution, but we'll talk about church. Our churches can really fall into the trap of being treated as like personal gratification machines. Like, well, I'm in charge of worship, or I'm in charge of this, or I'm in charge of that, or I donate money, so I expect a certain level of having my ass kissed, or whatever it is.
14 of my song requests should be granted this month because of my tithe.
Right. That happens.
Put my quarter in the jukebox.
You understand. That's a really good way to put it. And you understand that it happens because people are broken, but they try to, I don't know, they try to heal themselves through pushing these buttons that they think are just going to bring them that drip, that morphine drip of feeling good, without ever getting at that root cause of like, maybe if I turned my eyes upon Jesus instead of just sang that song, I wouldn't define myself by how shitty I feel when I don't get my own way.
Yeah. I think that there's something to be said, and I'll just talk a little bit about leading worship because it's something that I've done. I think there's something about creating an experience together when we come and gather. And some of that is singing, and some of that is reading, and some of that is all sorts of different things. And I think that sometimes as a church, we actually limit the scope of what we can do as a gathering because we have this tradition that says that we have to do it these ways. And other times I think that we limit ourselves because we are so busy like trying to chase all these new things that we potentially do, because I think there's some beauty in routine and ritual as well. So like there's both sides of that. But when you're coming to an experience like that, I just want to make sure it's clear, like this isn't Chris and I saying that members of that community can't be involved in the curation of an experience together. In fact, I welcome that. And I think that's incredibly meaningful if Chris and I are planning something together and we know it's going to benefit like a group of people. And that group of people is also chiming in saying, this is what we want in order to feel like we can experience that community together and experience worship and experience learning and all those other things. So it should be a mutually beneficial experience. But to Chris's point, it's not a vending machine where you just get to like poke in your code and you get out whatever you want out of it. Like it's truly collaboration where sometimes you get some things and sometimes you don't. And hopefully in the process of working with other people and talking about it and experiencing it, like you take joy even when something isn't that meaningful to you because you know it's meaningful to someone else. So I don't know. That's my take on it.
There's this built-in tension in Christianity, especially of the kingdom is here, but the kingdom is not fully here. Yeah. So in an ideal world, all of our worship gatherings would be a situation where we all come with a couple ideas and we do it all together. And that's kind of what Quakers do. Yeah. So, like they let the Spirit really move. And I think for all kinds of reasons that have to do with really ingrown anxieties, most people are not comfortable with that, right? So what they do instead is they do one of two things. They make the liturgy and the ritual sacrosanct because there can never be deviation, so then there's no anxiety. Yep. Or they try to push their own agenda because at least they're getting their way, and that's the way that they alleviate anxiety. Yeah. But it reminds me of how we're not there yet, because when the Samaritan woman and Jesus are talking, she says, well, if you're such a great rabbi, answer me this, Messiah. And she says, you Jews, and that's the term she uses, you Jews say that we must worship in the temple, but our ancestors in Samaria say we should worship on the holy mountain. Which one's right? And Jesus says, I tell you this, the time is coming and is now here where you will not worship either in the temple or on the mountain, but in spirit and in truth. Yeah. And that gives me chills, first of all, thinking about that. But that names the tension. It's coming and it's here, but it's not fully here. And you're asking very human, natural questions because of the ways that you process anxiety and the ways you process your need to control even worship and even God and even other people's experience of those things. I had a dream one time. I was going through a really hard time in a church where we were dealing with all of this stuff. And I had this dream where I got to church, and it wasn't the church I was in. It was just some church. And the worship leader was Leonard Cohen.
Nice.
And he was wearing a green suit. And there was no set anything. And all it was people saying, let's do this one next. Let's do that one next. And everything was from the movement of the people and the Spirit, and the people letting themselves be moved by the Spirit. And the reason I think he was wearing a green suit in my subconscious is because that's the ultimate model for sustainable worship, right? In a truly healed and whole and healthy sense. And we know that, but until we really trust our healing to Jesus, we're not going to get there, I think.
This is sort of a tangent off of that, Chris. So, take it for what it is. And, hopefully we'll get back on track in a little bit. But I think the other issue
we're already there.
I know, we're already way off track. We'll get back to Jacob and Esau in a minute. I think the other issue is in the first century church especially, there's this idea of like, we can't let this get too big before we just need to move on. And you can do that sort of community and that sort of engagement when there's maybe 10 to 20 people, maybe even a little bit more. But once you have 4,000 people in a church, you can't get everyone together and have people participate that way. Like, it just doesn't work. So that's not to knock mega churches, because there's still a way of worshiping in those that's still authentic and true and good. But I think to what you're saying is, like, if you really truly want to experience community, there's got to be a place where you and other people can get together and have that true experience where there's unity and tension, and you're putting things out there and people are also, doing the same thing.
And if there are mega churches that are doing things well, I think one of the things they prioritize is helping people see the necessity of smaller and more authentic community than just that Sunday morning 8 campus simulcast experience.
Yeah.
And I may even go a step further and say, it seems to be the more mega a mega church gets, the more insulated and protected people at the very top are from any kind of accountability, as well, for the exact same reasons, because it's so big, and they're so powerful. And every time a mega church pastor or leadership team falls, we see the same story. It was personality driven. It was toxic. It was this, it was that, because it got too big to fail. And I think there's a word of warning in that for us from what you're saying.
Yeah. It's interesting. I watched the documentary that I think Amazon did on Hillsong Church and Carl Lentz. And, for all of Carl's flaws, I had some compassion for the guy in the midst of it. I'm like watching it going like, oh man, he just was not set up for success. And again, I know that this documentary has a lens that they're seeing through it, and you don't never get the whole story, but we put so much pressure on these pastors, these personalities, to be everything to everyone, and they just can't.
Yeah.
They just can't. That's business, not religion. There's no commander-in-chief of the church, right? It just doesn't work that way. I mean, there is, but it's not you. It's not me, and it's not Carl Lentz, and it's not Joel Osteen, right?
Right.
There's no human being that can take on that role. It's, it takes the entire church to be the bride of Christ, not one person to be the bride of Christ that can then do that for everyone else. And, again, I'm not knocking Catholicism either, because I think there's something beautiful in having like a really good hierarchy, but like having one guy at the top that's involved and like responsible for the entire community, I think that's too much weight to put on any one human. And I don't know that's necessarily what Jesus intended when he said, on this rock I'll build my church. I don't think that he was saying like, Peter, you've got to be this person that's now responsible for the entirety of Christianity, right? I don't know that's necessarily outworking that was really intended. So anyway.
Yeah. I think that's well
Pray
said.
for the Pope, man. He's got a lot of responsibilities on his shoulder.
Absolutely. And, and I love it when the only times I'm really like, go hierarchy is when the Pope says stuff that I think is awesome.
Yeah.
And he does that a lot. This Pope does.
This Pope is known for washing people's feet and taking care of the poor and actually doing a lot more in the weeds, feet on the ground sort of stuff than I've seen from a lot of other people. And just, he's a pope of the people.
As much as you can be, right? Yeah. And I think, I can't speak for the guy, but it seems to me, in things that I've read and things that I've heard him say, things that I've read that he's written, his spirituality really does seem to be centered on the relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
And not that other popes aren't, but, like Pope Benedict, he was more interested in being the theologian in chief, right?
Right.
John Paul was fighting a Cold War, and his own personal spirituality had a lot to do also with the Marian tradition in Catholicism.
Yep.
I assume Francis's does as well, but Francis, in all of his public pronouncements, is always talking about Jesus.
Yeah.
And I think that makes a difference.
Yeah, it really does. I do want to go back to Jacob and Esau. As I've been sort of processing a lot of what we've been discussing, I think the one thing that maybe we need to give credit to Jacob for, because we haven't really given any credit to Jacob. We're kind of slamming Jacob a lot. Of the two brothers, he's the one that's willing to go and leave it behind.
Yeah.
And some of that's by necessity because he knows he's got a brother that's out to get him, right? So maybe not too much credit. But you've got Esau, who's just so desperate for his parents' approval that he's going to go get married to another person and stay close by to mom and dad and hope that they approve. And you've got Jacob, who's willing to go and leave it all behind. Even though he just basically inherited the whole thing, he's now losing the whole thing. And he's on the run, right? He's not taking the family fortune with him. He's bolting and he's leaving it all, leaving mom and dad, leaving the safety and the security and the income and the resources that he has to start something new. And so, just to give him a little credit here, because I think we haven't given him any credit at all so far.
Yeah. And we'll see in the coming chapters that he literally has to start from zero in Laban's household, even though Laban is part of that kin that Rebecca was so concerned with.
Yeah. Yeah. So on that note, I think leaving is always really hard, but be willing to start the next thing without taking the current thing with you. Anything? I know we usually talk a little bit about pop culture, at least. I know you go to the movies a lot. Have you seen anything recently? Anything new or interesting with the family?
So I rewatched this week a movie that I had not watched since it first came out during the pandemic, which was Raya and the Last Dragon.
Oh yeah.
I really like it. And I remembered liking it, but then watching it again a second time with my family, and even my older son, who's 16, he watched it with us again, and it's really good. And I don't know if I have anything else to say about it than that, but I would say, hey, that's a great movie, and there's a lot of goodness to it, and it's a really good observation of the good that people can achieve if you help them to see the good in themselves.
Yeah.
Rather than always leading defensively with your elbows, rather than with your heart. So
I think Disney, Pixar, I don't know, was that Pixar or was that just Disney?
I think it was Pixar. Yeah.
Because I remember Disney/Pixar and the combination films, they had like a run of, I'll call them COVID films. And I feel like most of them were really well done, but they never really made it in the box office because clearly like theaters were closed and no one was going back. I think it's like only now that people are even starting to get back to the theater, and it's not pre-pandemic levels for sure. And I do think it's interesting to see like how this is going to change those stories and what stories we actually get and how much money is invested into movies in the future, because they're just not getting the returns that they thought that they would get from the box office, and putting them all in Disney Plus. There's only a certain amount of new money you're going to get from that, because once you max out the Disney Plus membership, like there's if you don't have it already, like it's unlikely that one more movie from Pixar is going to actually make you want to go buy a Disney Plus subscription. So, I do think that there's a little bit of like in my heart just wondering what the future of the animation world and the movie industry is in general, because it's, are we going to see those kind of stories and that kind of investment in stories?
It's a great question. And we think about implications of AI. We think about implications of augmented reality in terms of how we consume narrative and all those different things. And who knows what the world's going to look like 2, 3, 4 years from now when it comes to how we receive our stories, how we tell our stories. And I think that matters for the way we let stories resonate and help heal us, So that's an important question and an important observation. And humans are not always great at reining in our technology so that our emotions can catch up. So I guess we'll see.
Yeah. I watched. I went to see Godzilla.
Yeah.
They actually did a release of Godzilla -1 that was -1 minus color.
Right.
So
Yeah,
I couldn't even.
you went with your son to see that.
Yeah,
right?
I
One
went
of
to
your
see my
sons?
older two sons. We went to go see that, and I thought that was really well done. If you haven't seen it yet, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but it was probably one of the. Well, I have not actually watched a Godzilla movie other than the American versions of it, so I don't really have the context of the Japanese films to like compare it against. I think I watched the 1999 version. Remember that one?
I just remember because the soundtrack was Jimmy Page and Puff Daddy on a track together.
Yeah.
And, it was Kashmir, but Puff Daddy.
That was the 90s encapsulated is Jimmy Page and P. Diddy doing stuff together.
Yep.
But I do think that there is something really cool about Godzilla. It caused a lot of good questions for my kids about World War II and the aftermath, because if you look at the Godzilla is, I think, not just subtly, but clearly overtly a metaphor for atomic destruction. It's this existential dread that you're watching playing out from the Japanese people about, like, what part did we actually play in this? And what part didn't we play in this? And it's just fascinating to see the juxtaposition of like honor and my responsibility towards my country, and also this existential threat to what we're doing. And it was just really overall a pretty good story. I really enjoyed watching it. So if anybody hasn't seen Godzilla at all, that would probably be a good one to start with. Godzilla -1, either in color or in black and white. I watched the black and white version one with subtitles, so I got all the Japanese stuff in subtitles, and it was still just terrific. But it felt like a 1950s, 1960s film, even though it was,
that's pretty cool,
with the modern enhancements of technology. So it was really well done. Really well done.
Good stuff, man. From Pixar dragons to another kind of an atomic dragon, I guess you could say.
Right.
Good stuff.
That's right.
Hey, I have a quick question about that film.
Yeah.
Is the -1 part of the title, is it like a prequel, or where does -1 come from?
So that's a good question. -1 comes from the idea that post-World War II, what do you have when there's nothing? And then you have even less.
Wow.
Right? So
Yeah.
that's where that idea comes from, is like when we're at the bottom and then even more is taken from us. That's -1.
Wow.
Like we're not even at zero anymore. And I think that's a good symbolism of the end of World War II. And I'm not like a World War II buff, so I don't know this for a fact, but it does seem like a lot of Japanese resources were bent into World War II, and they were kind of left with nothing. And now their cities are demolished, and they're basically less than nothing. Like they're worse than they started out. And so I think that's part of that symbolism, is that -1. It's like we're not just at zero; we're actually taking steps back.
That's profound. Thank you for explaining that.
That's not just post World War II. There's lots of situations where, like Jacob and Esau, where like you start out and now you're actually worse off than you were before, right? So Esau is not just in a bad situation where he doesn't just not have the birthright. He's also now got this extra wife to contend with, right? And Jacob, who has stolen the birthright and all the family fortune, is now like on the run and has nothing, right? So he's actually worse off than he was when he had his family's honor and protection, and even if he wasn't the the chosen one. So like both brothers are -1 in this story. So Jacob and Esau -1.
I love that. I mean, it's terrible, but I love it.
Yeah.
Terrible existentially, not in terms of the way you put it.
Yeah. That's good.
Thank you so much, Nathan. I think this was really rich.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. I really enjoy this. Before we go, a quick plug. You may see Chris and I on a sister podcast coming up. We have been invited to participate in the Phoenix Effect podcast. The Phoenix Effect podcast is actually hosted by my wife, so she actually invited us to be a part of it. Chris, I'm looking forward to hearing a little bit more about you and your goal of creating this whole place for us to talk about these issues and what it means for us to belong. And what it means to try to find belonging.
I'm looking forward to it, and I'm honored that we got asked to do that. So
that's pretty cool.
Absolutely. Hey, I'll tell you something really funny before we sign off. Most weeks I'm late because the baby. This week I was not late, but I could not find my toothpaste. It was so bizarre. And all I had was my toddler's Listerine, which was pink lemonade flavored. And it was delicious.
Gotta do what you gotta do.
So I have my electric toothbrush, just trying to get them a little bit white for the podcast, and the pink lemonade Listerine, which blocks some of the yellow in the spectrum. So I guess it worked, but it was tasty. I didn't swallow, but it was tasty.
Oh man, I've got the mint Listerine that my kids like to have, but I don't think I've ever tasted anything that wasn't the mint flavored. I'll check that out sometime if it's good.
Word to the wise, Mr. Clean is the same color as the blue Listerine.
Be careful with that for sure.
Syllabically, Mr. Clean and Listerine are the same damn thing. So you can really get in trouble quickly with that.
Yeah. Just don't mix up your bottles.
That almost happened to me last week, but I dodged a bullet.
I actually have something kind of interesting with toothbrushes. I have this drawer full of toothbrushes downstairs, and like Alex is now trying to grab toothbrushes because he wants to brush his teeth all the time. And
sure,
I realized that I had one that I used for like the grout. So like it's not for the teeth, it's actually, but I don't know which one it is because they all look the same. And so he's grabbing toothbrushes and putting them in his mouth. I'm like, oh no, like one of those has bleach on it. We need to get that out of his mouth. So like threw out all the toothbrushes. I'm sure that some of them were not actually bleach infected or infested, but it's like, oh man, I gotta kill the kid.
And the third kid is always way more resilient than the first.
That's right. He'll be fine. He'll be fine with a little.
It's like how Job gets those replacement kids we were talking about.
It'll take care of his. So.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh man. Hey, thanks for sharing a little bit of time with me today.
Absolutely, thank you. It felt really good.